Okay, guys, so welcome to our first of several talks regarding this app we're going to be making together called penult.am.
This is such a deco app.
It's the best app.
Such a deco fun.
Anyway, so far we've been working with this framework called bottle.py, which is pretty nice. It's a very small micro framework. We picked it because it's very easy to install and set up. But now that supposedly everyone in the room has Flask set up, and if not, you can look in last week's meeting notes or online, there's Google. We're going to actually start using Flask, which is used a lot more out there in industry. And it also has a few extra features. And I have a link here on this week's event page with some resources, basically some snippets of code that we're going to be using at some point, a few points. And I'm actually going to more or less do most of what I have planned for today right here in front of you guys. Okay. So when we get started, I'm just going to go ahead and make a new directory for this thing, WebDev. Make the lesson 08. How does this happen? Okay. And so the first thing you want to do is, if you're running a Unix system, you want to make sure we're using a virtual environment. If you're using Windows, then we'll just be using PAP and Flask, so you don't have to worry about it. But for my case, I'm going to be running virtual env3. In most cases, it's just going to be virtual env. And then you give it some sort of environment folder where everything is going to be saved. And what this does is basically it installs a local copy of the Python executable and PAP, which means that now I can run env/bin/pip and use it to install modules like Flask. And we'll actually go ahead and install Flask for me once it finishes downloading and setting up. Yep, doesn't take too long. Yep. And now if we were to try and run the Python binary that I have over here in the env/binary folder, I can do import Flask. And then I have stuff like flask.flask. Flask. And yeah, so that works. That's a good sign. What we're going to be using, though, is we're going to be using PAP along with something called the requirements.txt file. So I'm going to make a new file in my root folder. I'm going to call this one requirements. Did I spell it right? Yeah. And all that we really need for this file is basically on every line of this file, we're going to have a name of a package that we want to be using in our project. And the reason why we want to have it is so that when someone else is downloading your project, they don't have to manually install every single package. They can just tell PAP to look at this requirements file and install all the packages that you designated as needed. So we already installed Flask, but we want to make sure that we say here we want to be using Flask. And you can do stuff like also designate what version we're using, which we'll probably add a little later. But for now, we just want to say use Flask. And we're also going to be using another package called flask-sql alchemy. And this is going to help us make our models using some sort of SQL backend. Could it be SQLite or MySQL or Postgres, etc. It's just going to make it easier and a little bit more object-oriented for us. So once we have this file, just two simple lines in it, we can do the same command I used earlier to install Flask, except that instead of telling it the name of the package we want, we give it the option -r, which means -requirement file, and then the name of our requirements.txt. And it's probably going to tell me that Flask is already installed, and it's going to start installing SQL Alchemy, which I think takes a little bit longer for some reason. In the meantime, I'll open up Google and search for Google.
We got Bing, man.
Bing. I think it's the first time I go to Bing. Okay, I think give it not enough time. Let's search for Google. Let's go over here. Let's go to Bing. It's getting harder to tell which one I'm actually in. Still no. Show me how. Oh, really? Click open below. Can't click open. You know what this means, right? PHP Hammer. Here we go. So, SQL Alchemy finished installing. That's great. So now we have these two things, we can actually move on to the next step, which will be actually setting up kind of our app. So, so far all we have is this environment folder contains the things that we use, basically the packages that we use, and Python binary, and we have the requires.txt, and we want to basically, so it's a good pattern, especially for apps that grow larger and larger over time, to kind of separate out into individual modules, and then each module is kind of responsible for a different part of the site. We can actually stick all of the website we're making, which is going to be a Last.fm clone, in its own module. But you might see if we offered other services, like if we had a back end for an Android app or those kind of things, it might make sense for us to put in a different module. But when you make a module, you want to start off by making a folder for it. So I'm just going to call this one penult. And then inside this thing, I want to make underscore init .py. And what this gives me the ability to do is that normally when you have an import command in Python, you give it a path to some sort of .py file. And when you do that, it's going to go ahead and just load that file into scope as whatever namespace you provided. So if I say, import bottle, when we were using bottle.py, it looks for a file named bottle.py in the same folder, and it saves it as a bottle variable that you could do stuff like load the redirect function from, etc. But when you have a folder that has an __init __.py file in it, if you do the same thing, you do an import command with that folder's name, which in this case would be penult, what it would do is, instead of just giving you an error saying the path you provided is a .py file, it's going to go ahead and look for a .init file, and then __init file, that is, and load that file as your module. And that's done pretty often nowadays. It's a very common pattern for producing Python modules. Okay, and so what we want to do here is we want to basically initialize in our module a Flask app, which we do by importing from Flask this uppercase Flask thing. And what this variable does is it's a constructor for creating apps. So if we want to create an app, we just kind of execute this Flask function we called, and we need to give it something. It's kind of like the name of the app, so we can identify, if we have separate apps, we can identify which one is which. And a useful thing is the Python built-in variable called name, which is going to usually be the command that actually executed it or something to that style. So this is basically our init file. It's going to execute a Flask. It's going to execute Flask to produce an app. And then in our root folder that contains our penult folder, we want to create basically some sort of py file that would actually run our server. That's going to be what we tell other services, or what we execute from command line we want the server to be running. And this run server is also going to be a very simple file. It's going to take penult, it's going to import app from it. Import app. And penult in this case, because it's not a pre-built module, it's going to see that there's a folder called penult in the same root folder for my app, and then it's going to basically import the init file as that. And that init file, let's see, penult _init, has an app variable in it, which means that we're importing into this namespace app. And once we do that, we can actually run it. Debug equals true, just like that. And I can do things over here like say app.route and then define hello world function of some sort that just returns the string hello. Yeah, and if in the same folder I run my Python binary, which for those of you who are just using who aren't using virtual env could just use Python as a binary by itself. Earlier you would have used pip instead of env-bin-pip. But in my case, I'm going to go into the specific Python executable and use it to run server. It's going to tell me that I have one running now on localhost at port 5000. Localhost 5000. And you can see that there's hello. That's the same hello that I wrote over here. Basically, my run server is now importing the app I created in penult, in the penult folder, which contains this route for hello. So it looks like we're set with kind of like a basic Flask setup. Now we want to actually start designing our application. And to do this, we want to start probably from our models. Like I said, we're going to be making a last.fm clone. And today we're just going to worry about setting up kind of like this library of artists. So in my penult folder, I'm going to make a new file called models.py, and that's where I'm going to be storing most of my models. And I want to basically import app from penult, which we'll be doing in most files actually, because usually we want to save things to this app. And then I'm going to import the SQL Alchemy library. And where this is located, because it's not just SQL Alchemy, when we installed it in our requirements.txt file. Okay, the computer is burning, I guess. When we installed SQL Alchemy, we installed the module flask-SQL Alchemy, which is nice because it automatically saves it under a different namespace, which is flask.ext for external, and then SQL Alchemy. So from this one, we can import SQL Alchemy. And now we want to basically configure our app. So there's a config method, or rather a config dictionary that we give it SQL Alchemy database URI, which if you're using something like MySQL will be usually a local host at some port. But since we're going to be using SQLite for now, we could just say, we can give it what's called a SQLite URI, which when you give it SQLite colon followed by 3 slashes, it's going to be a relative path to a database file, which we can just call database.db. Redundant, but it works. And what it's going to do is it's basically going to create a database.db file within our project root folder, and that's where it's going to be storing our models when they're actually put into a database. And once we configure it, we want to basically run this SQL Alchemy class that we imported over here from the SQL Alchemy module. And we want to run it and give it our app so that it knows to configure our SQL Alchemy database for this app. And now we're actually moving on to defining our models. And we probably want to make a model for artists. We're going to be using Python classes for this. And we're going to use inheritance, inheriting from a model class that's already provided to us by SQL Alchemy. And within kind of like the attributes section, we want to define the attributes that belong to this class. So it makes sense that you'll have some sort of an ID field, which will be the primary key. And we're just going to call it db.column, db.integer, and primary key equals true. And this is basically how you would configure columns in our SQL database if you know anything about SQL. So this particular column is going to be named ID, and it's going to contain an integer field, which is going to be used as the primary key. We're going to do the same thing for our name. Column db.string, and I'm going to limit it to 128 characters. Age of our artist, just going to be an integer. And then we're going to have a bio, which is just going to be some sort of text. And in addition to this, we need to define a constructor, just like you would for most normal Python classes. We're going to give it parameters which are going to be containing the fields for our object. And then we're just going to do the same thing you would with normal constructor in Python, and just set our local, basically our object fields into the local variables for this function. If you've done any kind of I/O, this should probably look familiar. And then we probably want to write a different representation just to make life easier on us. Self. Artist. Something like that. And there we go. And once we have this thing set up, we can actually do some experimentation with it. Just open up Python within our project folder, and from penult.models, import artist. And now we can create a new artist by just kind of running the class constructor. And it takes a name, so we'll call this guy Adam. It takes an age, he's 89 years old, and his bio is I am Adam. Atomic, the worst. There we go. And now we can look at artist, and we have an artist object named Adam. And the nice thing about having our classes, basically our models done through SQL Alchemy, is that we can very easily save those to our database. And then once we do it, we have all sorts of different ways to query for things in the database, to update, delete, and so forth. Most of those actions will match very closely with what we do with RESTful APIs. And if we want to access this, all we really need to do is import db from the same file. And then we do db.session, basically the currently running database session. We want to add the artist that we created, and then we can commit it to the database. And what this does, so before that, you need to do create all. And what db.createAll does is it actually creates the tables which need to be created before you actually save anything to them, which I forgot to do. But now I can add artist to it, and I can commit it. SQL. This session has been rolled back due to a previous. Looks like it's SQLite. SQLite doesn't need to run. It runs always. Let me just quickly do the same thing again. I want to from this thing. Let's create our new artist. The worst. Wrong key. Artist, and now we want to do the same thing, just import db.session.add. Did I do something wrong?
It's the same thing you did last time.
Yeah, last time I forgot to initialize my tables beforehand, which gave me an error and then refuses to continue.
You do that. Okay.
Yeah. So what I did now from command line, and the same code can be used in the actual project. I basically imported the artist object from my models file. I created a new instance of it, and then I added it to the currently running database session, and then I committed the session into the actual hard drive. So until you run commit, then artist isn't actually going to be saved. And once you do commit it, then usually you'd have access to this artist.id, which will be the ID of the artist in the database. And using the capital A artist, basically the model that we use to instantiate new objects, we could do artist.query, I believe .all, and then it basically returns an array containing all of my artists. I can also do get, and then by giving it some sort of primary key, which in this case I can see the artist.id, which is the primary key, is 1. I can get that specific object in my database. I can also give it a key that doesn't exist, and it's going to return nothing because that doesn't exist. Okay, so that's all the setup we need to do for models. And because we're using SQL Alchemy, which is an external library, we don't have to do anything like what we did a couple of weeks ago when working with models. We don't have to write our own update method or our own create new or anything else. We just need to tell SQL Alchemy what our models look like, and it's going to be doing the rest for us. Okay, we have this. And now that we have models, we can actually start looking into writing a controller. So like I said, our application, the specific module that controls kind of like the web application part of our bigger application, if we wanted to have more than that, is going to be saved in our penult folder. So I'm going to put a new py file in it and call it artists.py, which is going to contain basically all of the code that is responsible for the path for managing artists. At the very top, I want to import from Flask, import a few function. For now, I'm just going to leave it at star, but later on we're going to dwindle this down only to the ones that we actually use. And then from penult, I want to import app. Basically, from my --_ init file, I want to import the app thing, which is where we configure all of our routes. And then from penult.models, which is where we store all of the SQLite config, I want to import artist and DB. So I can do the same thing I did in the Python interpreter earlier, which was create a new artist and save it to a currently going session. Now we can start doing app.routes. And we can say that /artists will be where you get a list of all the artists, as well as that, maybe route redirects to the same place. And all we can do basically get a list of artists by querying everything. And then we can return them. So I'm actually going to return them as basically a string using this string kind of like object notation, and just tell it return artists. Okay. And one of the things that I usually do that I'm not doing right now is I'm not switching over and restarting my server every time, because unlike model.py, Flask does it for you. So at some point I started the server, and now whenever I modify it, I can just kind of let it do it on its own. I do believe though that I need to modify my run server from penult import app, or maybe artist, what I have over here in init.py. Yeah, I need to modify penult init, because right now it only has this static route in it. Instead of doing that and just defining all my routes in this file, all I really need to do is import this artist.py file, penult.artist. And then what it does is it basically goes into this file and defines all the routes that are in it within the same app. Yeah. Penult. I actually call this file artists. So now I start my server, and if I try and run over here, global name artist not defined. In which file? Artists. I would just type artist where I should have done artists. Yep. Artist. Okay, and the server was restarted for me, and I have an empty array. It actually does contain something in it, and what it contains is this representation over here. So if I look at the source, you can see it contains my representation for artist, which is currently being misinterpreted for an HTML tag. And if we wanted to fix that so we can take a look at it a little bit better, one of the things we can do is go into our models and just replace these angle brackets with something like square brackets. That'll be a little bit nicer on us. Yeah, so you can see that my artists have a single one named Adam. His name is Adam. He's an artist.
Why do you need the brackets?
These brackets, just because if I didn't have it, then you would just think it's a string. So I want to do something to designate it as an object and not so when you print it at the console, it doesn't look like this is the value. It's a representation of something else.
So why were the brackets making that work?
It's normal Python convention to use these kind of brackets when you represent an object. In fact, it's done all over the place. If I were to just run Python and do stuff like type of something, you can see that most objects are represented using brackets. What was the question?
Like why this not work?
Oh, and the reason why it doesn't work in HTML is because the browser thinks that it's an HTML tag called artist. And we're just doing it so we could see it better. Earlier, when I still had the angle brackets, I could look at the source and see it there. You just don't see any representation on the actual page. Okay, so let's go ahead and write the rest of our controller. And most of this is going to be very similar compared to what we did earlier in penult.py. So I'm thinking it might just be easier for me to do a little bit of creative copy pasting. This isn't the right file for this. So in artist.py, where we have our route for getting all the artists, we naturally also want to have app.route for a specific artist. And we want to basically have a second path. It's going to be a wildcard, some sort of integer. We can call it artist ID. And this is going to be some sort of show artist ID. And in this case, we're actually just going to go into our database and use the get function with the artist ID again. And then we can say that if it exists, go ahead and return a representation of that artist. Otherwise, we could probably just run abort 404, not found. And now, not found. We start with reloader. Could it be 0? What's your ID, Adam?
Well, my social security number is.
You don't know your ID?
It's one.
If artist.
Probably like 40 or a billion.
Oh yeah, artists /1. And here's Adam,
Yay.
which is different from that.
Why don't you put in, instead of those braces, you should put in ampersand LT colon.
What?
Ampersand LT semicolon.
Ampersand LT semicolon.
Yeah. There, GP.
Yeah, that only works when it's an HTTP representation. So if I were to print it in the console, it will actually show me ampersand LT, which is a little weird, but I guess we can live with that. Whatever. We're not going to keep this representation of it for very long. We're going to write our own view for it. Okay. Now we implemented the two gets. It makes sense to implement a way to post new ones, which really just means that since we create a new artist resource, we tell our RESTful API, go to artist, and using post, basically you want to create some sort of, like that. You want to create a new object in the database, def create artist, no parameters. And what we want to do is we basically so in the Flask module that we imported in the first line, we have this request object, and when we're inside a request handler like this one, we can have access to request.form, and this contains basically post form fields. So we can expect the user to give us some sort of name and age in a bio field. Thanks. And then we can say that if none of those are equal to none, it's a quick shortcut to do that. Then we want to go ahead and create a new artist. Just say artist is a new artist. Name will be the name. Age will be the age variables, and bio will be bio, naturally. And then we do the same thing we did in the interpreter earlier. We go to the currently running session, we add artist to it, and then we commit this session dot commit. And once we have it, we can actually look at the artist ID. And then we can redirect the user to artist slash that artist ID. This is actually kind of pointless. I can just replace this with a dot. I'll do that. And one of the things that we could give the redirect method is code. And our options are really code 303 or code 307. The difference between the two is that if we were to write code 307 over here, it would tell the browser to redirect, but maintain the original HTTP verb it was using. So if I send a post into /artist and then redirect it with the 307, it's going to make a post at whatever path I gave it over here. If I have a 303, then not only is it going to be redirected to this new path, it's also going to switch to a GET request, which is what we want because we want to redirect it to this little function handler over here. And all of this is the return statement from our if statement if everything worked out nicely. If not, we probably want to abort with a 500 error saying that the request was incorrect. What we can do now, we can open up some sort of RESTful API, and then we can post over here some form data. And once we do that, if I go into artist and refresh it, then I have Adam, and I also have a new artist called new artist, who's going to be age 12 and has as its bio the text test. Yeah, so this one we have get and post. We can create and we can read our artist. The two things that we want to add in addition to that are probably put for update and delete. And to save time and effort, I'm just going to copy what I have in my prepared earlier. And this is the code for delete. It looks the same as the get for, at least in terms of the decorate over here. It looks the same as getting a specific artist. The only difference, the method is delete. In which case, what we want to do is we run artist.query, and then we filter everything that matches the current ID, and we run delete on it. And we do the same redirect that we did now. This is actually very, very similar to what we did in our earlier MVC example. And then the one for updating is probably the longest one so far, just because I do some form validation. And it works the same way as the other two. I go into artist/artist ID using a put. And then what I do is I start off by querying the artist by ID, and then I have these kind of like if statements to see if the user provided to us in the form some sort of field that we want to update. I want to update it. And at the end, after I modified it, I added the new version of the artist to my session, commit it, and then I'm done. All of this is very similar to what we did earlier. The only difference is that now we're using SQL Alchemy, whereas a few weeks ago when we were using this with BottlePR, we were using their own thing. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So for this update one, does it, you use session.add artist, does it create a new artist, or does it just overwrite the?
Yeah. So the way it works is when I query an artist from the database, it would usually have an ID field. Whereas when I create a new one, it doesn't have it until that I save it to the database. And when I add it and commit, when I add it to a session and commit it, if it has an ID one, it runs an update, giving it new information. If it doesn't have an update, if it doesn't have an ID field, it's going to create it.
Basically, if it exists, it'll update. If it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Since ID is a unique identifier, it can afford to do that, naturally. Okay. And that's basically all of our controller. At this point, I can change this to a put. And now I can modify Adam to be age. It's probably a bad idea to change his age because we don't have a way to represent the age. So let's change Adam to Atomic. He changed his name. What a jerk. There we go. And now if I go back into my local host, I can see that I don't have Adam, I have Atomic, and then I have new artist. And I can do the same with my new artist, call him WebDev. And there we go. I can also delete by changing the method to delete and saying I want to delete too. So I think I may have forgotten to modify my delete function. ID is artist ID dot delete for artists. Didn't delete. Delete isn't working in this example. Does anyone see a reason why it doesn't work? Filter by dot delete.
What is URL for?
URL for is another function that's provided to us by Flask. I give it a string, which is going to be the same name as a function in this file, like this function called artists. And then it gives me whatever redirection URL I need to get to this function to execute. So if artist is the function that shows me this page, all I have to do is say URL for dot artist or string artist, and then it would lead me there. Maybe I need to do db.session.commit. I don't know. It would be interesting if that's what's breaking it. There you go. That worked. So after deleting it, I need to commit the currently going session, and then we get rid of an artist. So Adam is no longer an artist. Sorry, Adam.
No, my hopes and dreams.
Artist formerly known as Adam.
I will continue posting videos on YouTube.
Or was he Adam?
The artist formerly known as Atomic, formerly known as Adam. Age 112. And his bio is I suck.
Aww.
The artist formerly known as Atomic, formerly known as Adam. Okay. So we've done models, we've done view. If you know anything, you probably know that the next thing is going to be, we've done Adam, done models. We've done controllers, we've done models. The next thing is going to be views. And views are going to be very, very similar to what we did earlier using model.py, because model.py is modeled around the same things that Flask did. So what I want to do is I want to create a new directory in my penult, which is going to be called templates. That's where we store all of our models. And then within that, I want to make one for showing all the artists. It's going to be an HTML file. And let's actually, before that, it would make more sense to probably make our layout template. And what this layout template is going to be is it's going to be a very basic HTML. We've done an almost identical thing with model.py. HTML, head, title. The only difference here is that now we're using this block and end block notation. And we have a slightly different notation, whereas beforehand we had double curly brackets. Now we have curly brackets %. And you can see that I have this block called head, and within it I have a subblock called title. In our other files, we define the same blocks, and then they're going to be replaced in it. Do you have a question?
Is this HTML with blocks, or is that like a framework?
It's not an HTML. It's provided by a frameworking engine called Jinja 2. And you can read the official documentation for it, and as well as a quick start guide. But just looking at Jinja 2, welcome to Jinja 2. It's a very popular one. I'm pretty sure that Yelp uses it. If that means anything to you guys.
Django uses it.
Who?
Django.
Yeah, Django. Django uses Jinja?
Well, I don't know if it's Django, but it uses blocks.
Yeah, I believe Django has its own templating engine, right?
It's very similar. That's why I thought it was
Yeah,
Django.
there's the Django template language. It's based on the same concept, I believe. But let's just do similar things with blocks. And now that we have it in our artist file, all we need to do is we need to start off saying that this thing extends an existing layout. And now we basically define all the different blocks that fall within it. For example, if we want to modify the title, all we have to do is we need to define the same block. So if I open up the second one at the side over here, you can see that I have a block called title. That if I follow the same notation, except this time I define the contents of it, everything that goes in between here is going to replace this block right over here. So I can basically define the title as being penult.am artist list. Yep. And let's actually write the block called content we have over there. And what this block is going to be doing is it's basically going to iterate through all the artists we have in the artist object. And then we want to define some sort of div for it. We use this using a basic for loop. And I already have it prepared over here. I just have a heading followed by a for loop. And the for loop here follows the same kind of curly brackets % as we do for most of our templating directives above it, like end block and block. And because we're not using the same Python indentation we usually have, we need to designate a very specific end for over here. And everything within it, because we're saying artist in artist, within this block we have access to an artist kind of field. So we can define a new anchor tag, give it a hyperlink to artist/artist.id, and maybe a heading for each of the artists, a small one for its age, and then bio. And that defines our template. But what we're missing now is we need to go back into our controller, which is penult.artists.py. And over here, where we used to just read all the artists and then print them, instead, we want to say, I believe it's render template. Render template. It's a function that's also provided from Flask over here. And then we give it the name of the template. So this is called artist.html. And then we have to define all the different things that fall within the context. Specifically, you can see how I'm making reference to this artists variable over here. I need to define that as being something. And I have the same name variable within my handler function. So I'm just going to do that. Go back over here, refresh, and then we have our artists go here, and then we have all the different artists. So you can see WebDev, age 12, and the artist formerly known as Adam, formerly known as Atomic, formerly known as Adam. And when I click on it, it shows me to the page, which could also probably use basically a similarly formatted layout. So I'm going to go ahead and create this one, just templates. I'm going to call this one artist, singular artist.html. And it's going to look almost the same with the exception that it's going to be missing the for block we had in the other one. You can see I have this content block over here. It just has artist.name, artist.m, and artist.bio, and I added a small go back button. So now if I refresh this page, if I first go into artist.py and tell it to render the template, render template, artist.html, artist equals artist, and there we go. Now we have the artist formerly known as Atomic, formerly known as Adam. We can go back and check out the artist known as WebDev. And this is basically how you did everything we've built so far using bal.py, with the exception that now we're actually using a database instead of just storing everything in memory. using Flask as a framework. And this is actually where we're going to be stopping today. And next week, we're going to pick up. On my own time, I'm going to be building the same kind of model view controller for song and for album. And I'll provide sample code for this next week. And then we're going to continue next week when we talk about setting up relationship between different objects. So for example, an artist would own an album would contain songs, and so forth. And beyond that, we'll probably talk about stuff like user authentication and setting up actions, and then a little bit more about the design of the site. And we're going to wrap it up with kind of like a working app. So does anyone have any questions before I end for today? Anything? Yes? Yeah. The framework we're using is called Flask, and it's found at flask.poco.org. You could also do it just searching Flask Python. It's fairly easy to set up. I have some simple code for it on our GitHub. You just have to go to github.com/GTWebDev. And the top thing right now would be the code I was working with right now. It has simple code, and I did screencast the whole thing. So we're going to put it up later, and you'll be able to see it by just going to today's event on ccorgs.com, which can be accessed from here. OK. Any other questions? Question?
Only tangentially related, but can you go back to on the page, the Flask? So the decorator, the app.route, what does that exactly do?
OK, so the question here is about how decorators really work. And the simple explanation of what it does is it designates whatever function follows the decorator as belonging to that route. So that when you access this route using the web browser, like we did over here, so you see if we access /artist, which is the route for our artists function, then basically the decorator tells Python, execute this function over here, and whatever the return value for it is what you need to return to the browser. That's kind of like the high-level explanation of what it is. If you're interested in how it works, then this app.route function is in itself a function that was defined by Flask. And that function is a parameter, in addition to the path over here that we give it, takes a function. And instead of just doing something like give it the function name over here, we could do artists. After we define the function, we could kind of try and do something that's give it the function name as a parameter. The same thing is done for you using the decorator syntax. But basically, the function that follows it is a parameter of that function. And what it does is it basically tells internally to Flask that the first parameter of this, which would be the function, goes with the second parameter, which is the path. And this way, Flask internally knows that when it sees this path, execute this function. I think that one of the language primers we talk about probably in 2 or 3 weeks, the more advanced, it's going to be it's not going to be a primer anymore, it's going to be advanced Python topics. I'm going to be giving an example of how decorators work. And we'll be writing our own, if you're interested. Yes, another question? Yeah, absolutely. So Flask has documentations, which include a quick start guide, as well as tutorial. And these two are always good starting points. Whenever you're working with a new API or framework, whatever resources they provide is almost always the best kind of launchpad to using it. Beyond that, of course, you either have books or online resources, which you can find by just doing Flask tutorial, find whatever. There's a mega tutorial part 1, Hello World. And then there are also books. So if you go to Amazon, you can search Flask, Python, getting started with, Python. I can swear there's a book about it. I think of Flask. O'Reilly, how do you spell it? O'Reilly, Flask. Oh God, I knew this would happen. There is a Flask book out there. Actually, I think that the Flask page.
Are you sure it's not just a book with the Flask socket?
There's something. There is a book somewhere about Flask, probably. If not, then you should write one and make a lot of money.
There are also books with Flask pockets. With Flask.
Yes, there are books that contain flasks. Good job, Felipe. Okay, anything else? No? Okay, so I think that's it for today. We still have some time, kind of like we have the room for. So if you had any problems setting what we had up tonight over here, we can stay a little longer and help you guys set it up. Okay? See you guys.